Hello again. This video is for the second task in the spring homework booklet, which is reminding ourselves how we go about planning an essay on an inspector calls. Remember, with an inspector calls, you don't get any example of the text, you don't get an extract, everything's from memory. Okay, so you normally get one question on a character and one question on a theme, and you have a choice between the two. And in here, this particular question has given you actually a quotation from Sheila to her mother, but we really must stop these silly pretenses. Actually, you could choose to use that in the essay and start to analyse it. They've given you a little quotation. There'd be nothing wrong with doing that. But the main thing is that Priestley is showing in his presentation of Mrs Birling that she often pretends to be something she's not. So we've got to start by thinking, what does she pretend to be that she isn't? Well, she pretends perhaps to be charitable. Okay, she pretends to be caring. And if you like, she possibly says that, she's above, or, if we like, poor behaviour. She would probably say that, she wouldn't be involved in anything scandalous. And we know in each of these cases that's not true. Now, quite interesting looking at this task, because it's not always simply a case of saying to yourself three quotations that Mrs Birling says. And actually, depending on what gold you learn, there isn't always three quotations. So, for example, I strongly recommend you plan a Gerald essay and think about what you would use. So I'm going to give you three quotations that I would use, but I'm perhaps not going to tell you everything about why I would use them. One of the things Mrs Birling does say is, she says at one point, "I'm very sorry, but I think she only had herself to blame." Now, she says that earlier in the play, so we know that that's ironic. That comes back later. What I want you to do for homework yourself is, on this plan, fill this area here about how that relates to Mrs Birling pretending to be something she is not. One quotation that I noticed isn't in the gold quotations, but it always comes to mind to me when we're talking about Mrs Birling, is girls of that class. Okay, and just as a reminder, there's that sort of impersonal tone to that. There's that distance. She pretends that there can't possibly be any links between her family and girls of that class, and obviously we learn that there are some links. So again, I don't want to give you all the information. Have a think about how would that talk to us about Mrs Birling pretending she's something that she's not. And then, of course, finally, I'm going to choose the inspector's quotation. We are responsible for each other, because we already know that Mrs Birling has said she's not responsible. Obviously, she's faced with the fact that her son is. And I think, this idea, ultimately, if we go back to the thing at the top, that a family couldn't be involved in scandal. She would not think she was linked to these girls, okay? So perhaps just add here, she would say there are no links, and of course Priestley would say that there are links, okay? Priestley would link us all. So I think that's enough to do a plan. I don't want to do the whole thing for you. Over the page, you're going to try and do an introduction. It's worth perhaps just thinking of some of the things to do with AO3 at this time. So that's the context. Of course, the NHS, knocking the camera now, NHS in 1948. That's a useful one to think about, isn't it? Okay. Possibly the idea of women's rights. The women's vote, and that attitude at the time that that was coming forward, and we needed to think about these kinds of things. There were the labour disputes of that period, and perhaps something along the lines of that. Mrs Birling is there as somebody that Priestley doesn't want people to be in the future. So have a look over. You've got notes on context and so forth. See if you can make sure you bring in some AO3. within your introduction and paragraph. So that's quite a brief video, but it's that bit of the homework is quite brief. The key thing now is use the next page to write your introduction. It's not the easiest question on Mrs Birling I've ever seen, but I think if you start to think through with the goal quotations, analysing what you could say, there's plenty you could say there to get yourself going. Okay, good luck.